I'm Brenda Holland, and I'm here to talk about my grandpa. My grandpa is Jacob Ellis, and he was a longtime resident of Missoula, but to begin with, he comes from a kind of interesting background. He's part of what they call the Volga Deutsch, a German-Russian. They were Germans who lived happily, I guess, in Germany. They were Protestants. They practiced their trade and raised their families. And Catherine the Great, who evidently was dumb enough to marry a Russian prince, inherited the throne and decided that she was going to modernize Russia. And to do that, she recruited Germans. So his family was a part of that original immigration movement from Germany to Russia, where they settled along the Volga River. They kept all of their German language intact, their Lutheran religion, they ran German schools. They were German in every sense of the word, but they lived in Russia. And everything went swimmingly for a few generations until Catherine died and her subsequent sons and relatives inherited the throne and decided that there were going to be some changes. And they began first with taxation, then outlawing their private schools, then outlawing their worship in the Lutheran Church, then outlawing a lot of other things. And the Germans were not extremely happy, needless to say. For my grandpa, the final straw was that he got drafted into the Russian army, where he served for a couple of years. We've never been sure whether he hightailed it out of the army on his own or whether he served a term, but at any rate, he got out, and he immediately grabbed his young son and his wife, his mother, a couple of brothers, a sister, and came from Russia as immigrants to America. They came to Lincoln, Nebraska, which was where a lot of the German Russians came because they worked for the railroad. They were recruited by the railroad. He worked for the CB&Q Railroad, which was a line that ran evidently from Phoenix, Arizona up to Chicago, and that's what he worked on originally. Well, he really didn't like that. He had been raised as a farm boy, and that's what he wanted to do, but it didn't seem to be very practical. So he ended up buying a hack, a surrey, a wagon, and starting the cab business in Lincoln, Nebraska. He had a lovely surrey with fringe on top and had a beautiful horse, and evidently was prospering until somebody, we were told that it was a drunk, one night dropped a lantern, burned his barn down, the horse died, the surrey was burned up, and he was without a job. Very soon after that, his wife and small son died. By then they had 3 additional children, so he was left with 3 children and no job. And very soon thereafter, he married my grandmother, Anna, who was also a German Russian and who was widowed. She had 2 little girls, and her husband had died in a flu epidemic as well. So they married, and he decided that he would try farming. So he went first to Michigan, where he tried to farm and raise sugar beets. Then that didn't work out, so he went to Glendale, Arizona to raise sugar beets. These guys weren't really swift farming in the desert, but anyway, he tried for a season, and that didn't work out, so he went to Portland, Oregon, where he tried again, and that didn't work, and finally he came to Montana. And in 1915, I believe it was, he settled in Park City, Montana, which is just to the west of Billings. It's almost a suburb of Billings now. And they did fairly well there until 1917-18. And if you remember the years, that was the time of the flu epidemic. It was also the time of World War I. It was also the time that the Depression hit Montana, one of the many. The market fell out of the sugar beet crop. There was no one that could sell sugar beets. And that, of course, provided sugar for everybody in America at that time. You didn't really rely on sugar cane. And so here he was, doing quite well, and then this terrible disaster occurred again. He was in the middle of the Depression. He lost the lease on his farm. and he was now forced to work for other people. My grandma, who was helping others who had the flu, contracted it herself and died. And my grandpa was left with 11 children, some of hers, the 2 girls she had, the 3 he had by his first wife, and the 5 they had of their own. 11 kids, no job. So he worked as a beet worker in the Billings area time and just followed the beets west to Missoula. When he got here, the family story is that he vowed he'd never touch another beet as long as he lived, which sounds pretty good to me. He bought a horse and wagon and started the garbage business here in Missoula. For 25 cents a house, he would collect your garbage. For that, he also would go down in your basements, since most of the people had their furnaces in the basement. He would empty your furnace, carry up the ashes and clinkers from your furnace, carry them upstairs and haul them away as well. The garbage dump was located at what is the old Fox Theater site. Some of you know that, or if you don't know that, it's right at the end of the what do I want to say, Orange Street Bridge, right there. And now it's the proposed site for the new Missoula Arts Center, so it should be kind of interesting to go from garbage to art. But he actually, amazingly, after all this disaster, when the whole country was falling apart, in 1927, when he started this garbage business, right before the great crash in '29, he prospered, believe it or not. He ended up employing about 6 to 8 people and provided for his family quite well. Many of the family worked for him. When he died in 1937, they sold the route because none of the children really wanted it. And the north part of town went to Mr. Raymond. The south part went to Mr. Stickney. Some of you may remember this, the Raymond family, the Stickney family. They're still here in town. When the Stickneys retired, the Bauer brothers bought that and took that garbage route over. So what Grandpa had started is actually still running today, just under different names. When Mary Ellen suggested that we do this, I said, Mary, he's not very important. And she said, well, he survived. But you know, as I started working on this, I realized he was pretty important. I don't know that many of us could bury 2 wives, lose our businesses 2 or 3 times, not speak the language very well, and prosper. My mother told the story of being in the first grade in 1918, learning to read English. And she said that there was a law passed nationally that German could not be spoken. And even at my grandma's funeral, they could not sing German hymns because German was outlawed because of the war. So Grandpa had to learn to speak English. And she said that he provided great joy to them as he sat at the kitchen table with her, learning to read from her reader. Her favorite story was a story about a butterfly, and she said that they always would make him read because he couldn't say butterfly, and he would always say butterflies, which just sent them into, you know, laughter because he couldn't pronounce it. But I think of him with no education really, speaking 3 languages. He spoke Russian, he spoke English, he spoke German, and read all 3 of those languages. Started 2 businesses, buried 2 wives and a son. And prospered. He was one of the founding members of the German Lutheran Church here in town, and was a faithful man all his life. So I guess he was pretty special, like a lot of others, and I'm sure many of your relatives too. So that was my grandpa. Thank you very much for listening.
Great story.